their extraordinary sort of capacity, the extraordinary way that koans work is really the subject of this talk, but looking at one in particular. And you're going to hear me say some things that, you know, some of you would have heard me say before, and some of you are going to be familiar with the koan that we look at. It's a very sweet, sort of tight little koan. It's very succinct, and it comes out of a story that's longer, but we're just going to home in on the precise koan itself. What is the last word? Okay, that's what we're looking at. What is the last word? Okay, now there is a little verse around the koan that we might get to if time permits. But initially, we're just gonna, I want to come at what koans are and why they're indeed valuable, indeed priceless, indeed without price. Okay, they are the original pearl of great price, or even better, the original pearl of no price. That's what a koan is. It's as small as a pearl and as big as what is beyond all conceivable value, what is beyond all conceivable mass, all conceivable size, all conceivable dimension. They're that big and bigger, even if they're nothing but the tiniest little granule of a pearl. They're still actually that huge. Okay, so now how can this possibly be? Let's, Henry, just ground me a little bit so I know what you're talking about. Okay, so koans come out of Buddhism. They come out of Buddhism with a little mix of Taoism. They really emerge out of the confluence of Buddhism when it reached China, beginning in the 1st century CE up to the sort of 5th, 6th centuries CE, when it started to really find its own sort of native form or a native expression of the original experience and teaching and discovery of Buddhism in a Chinese inflected form, a Taoism infused form known as Chan, which we know as Zen, which was the name. The word Chan became Zen when this form of Buddhism reached Japan around the 8th, 9th century. So koans are one of the key things that popped up in that confluence of Buddhism and Taoism, although you can very plausibly argue that something like koans were at work in the earliest days of Buddhism. Meaning by that, what I mean is that little gestures, little phrases, little actions that somehow open somebody up in the way that is designated, connoted by the word awakening, or bodhi, waking up. Hence, you know, from that same root, Buddha, awakened. Okay, now, so the Dharma, you know, the Buddhist Dharma has been ways, and one of those ways. But what we could say is something like this, you know, broadly speaking, the Dharma is a way of becoming much happier. That's really what it is, you know, and sort of maybe you can argue that it's one of two, broadly, very, very broadly speaking, kind of one of two ways. One way is by addressing the mechanics of misery, the mechanics of suffering, and starting to pick it apart and say, well, wait a minute, if you do this, or if you think this, or if you say this, these are what the consequences are going to be, and you know, this cog will turn that cog, and then that cog will turn that cog, and then you're going to be miserable. On the other hand, coming back here, if you don't turn this cork, you turn it the other way, this thing's going to turn that way, that thing's going to turn that way, and you're going to be happier. You know, it's kind of like that sort of mechanistic view of sort of really getting into how suffering is generated and working. I mean, of course, we're organic beings, so the mechanics of an organic being aren't as mechanical as that, but there's still, you know, actions and consequences of different kinds. So you can actually sort of analyze the process by which, you know, a being that is sufficiently fed and warm enough and has sort of loved ones around it, that has what seems like what would seem to be the basic needs of a life, can still suffer miserably. You know, how does that come about? It seems like on the whole, we do it much, much more and much more skillfully than many other creatures. Like, we are particularly good at being dissatisfied. You know, it seems that way. I mean, of course, we don't exactly know, but we do know that we do it very well. And it looks like crows and ravens and whales and, you know, and sharks and dragonflies and butterflies and worms and snails and jellyfish and octopuses even and many, many other creatures, you know, just don't do this thing of suffering, of being at odds with the world, and as well as we do. You know, we're talented at it, it seems, you know. So, but actually, that's not a talent we really want. So, how do we get more skillful at coming out of that talent? Gradually, we can tend it, we can study it, we can find out, oh yeah, there's that thing again, that resistance coming up, that aversion coming up, that greed for something. And well, what happens if I don't tell myself I've got to have it? You know, I just kind of quite like it, but I'm okay without it. You know, what happens then? Sure enough, there are ways of engineering the opposite of suffering, more contentment, basically. That's great. And the Dharma, subtle, exact, precise teachings within the Buddhist canon, are very, very wonderful, you know, set of resources that a lot of, as you know, contemporary psychologists are turning to and finding that they really have something very rich to bring to psychology. In fact, some people would say, plausibly, the Buddha was the first really intelligent, perceptive, non-religion based psychologist. You know, in other words, by non-religion based, I mean saying wasn't turning to sort of some otherworldly redemption, just saying, here's the suffering human, here's how we can work with the suffering human, you can do it yourself, this is how, a bit of guidance helps, you know, you can do it. So that's fantastic. Now, as you know, I think most of you, there's another side to the Buddhist project, which is not just reducing suffering kind of mechanistically. I know that's not exactly the right word, but please permit me to use it for a moment. Instead, doing something that really actually merits the term bodhi or bud, waking up. That there's another sort of, almost you could say, stage or threshold that isn't just about managing, reducing suffering. It's about actually seeing through the sort of entire system within which suffering is generated. In other words, above all, it's about seeing through, you could say, waking up from the dream of who we have thought we are. It's about waking up, meaning that there's a very different way of experiencing this moment whereby it's not filtered through the person I think I am, this being with all that, this person, this self with all its various attributes and past and tendencies. You know, we tend to filter our experience through this idea of who we think we are. And it's possible to find that who we think we are has been a dream. It's the most incredible thing. It's just a dream. And you might think, oh, that's scary. No, it's not scary, because basically it's a painful dream on the whole. Sure, it can have nice parts in it, but actually you don't lose any of the nice parts. If you wake up, you still have a much richer, even more nice parts, and far richer, far closer. You can connect with people much closer, and you connect with all the content of this moment much more closely, much more intimately, and the whole of life becomes rich because we've woken up from this painful supposition we were making about it and then believing in. So there's Dharma as, suffering management, and there's Dharma as waking up. And they can be closely related, because actually doing work in the sort of first territory really can aid with waking up in the second way, in the Dharma in the second way, waking up. And also they can help each other in that even if you've popped out of the dream, there'll be times when it sort of sneaks back in, and to have the tools of the other approach to hand is a really good help. Okay, so now some of us are much more inclined to one or the other of these two. I mean, probably I'd say on the whole, most people who come to meditation practice, this is a generalization, you may well not be in this category, but on the whole, I feel what I see is that most people who come to meditation are more in the first, and rightly and understandably so. They really just want to suffer less. But there are some people who, they may be suffering plenty, but they're hell-bent on really sort of making some kind of existential leap in their understanding of, or in their apprehending of what this life is, what this moment is. So, in a sense, koans, the koan way, I kind of want to say it's a little bit better for those second folks, the second category. I mean, I say that with hesitation because there's really no reason why you sort of can't do both. You could be working on your understanding of the engineering behind suffering and hacking it, intervening, and also getting interested in the engineering behind the illusion of being the separate self we tend to think we are, and possibly getting behind that. And so you can certainly do both. It's not one or the other. But by sort of inclination, some of us go one way more than the other. And at certain times in our lives, one will be more pertinent than the other. Okay, now, so with that in mind, koans, they are clearly more aiming at plan B, the waking up side. I want to now frame a little bit what koans are, how we might think about them. They're, as most of you know, they tend to be short phrases. Sometimes the short phrase itself is the koan. Sometimes the short phrase sort of refers to something that was said or done, or an action or a thing, and in a way then that thing or a thought of that thing becomes what the koan really is. Does a dog have Buddha nature? So a dog, does a dog? Is a dog awakened? Is really almost what the question is. Is a dog awakened? We're not going to go to that right now. Let me read you something. There's a little story from this remarkable book by Zachary Mason called The Lost Books of the Odyssey. If any of you don't know it, maybe many of you don't, in fact, it's a fantastic, strange little book of fiction with these sort of short stories that are purporting to be lost books from the Odyssey that never made it into the final Odyssey. And one of them is called Agamemnon and the Word. And in it, Agamemnon, the Greek king, is sort of old and weary, and he sort of lost all his faith in life, and he commissions his sort of wisest philosophers from his court to go off and make a single book that says everything that there is to be said in the entire world. In other words, a sort of utterly comprehensive kind of encyclopedia, but it's got to be exactly 1,000 pages long. So they go off and spend years, decades on this project, and finally they come back with this incredible, massive, enormous 1,000-page volume, specially bound and, you know, sort of, I don't know, several feet high and wide, and lay it out on the floor, and indeed it's got exactly 1,000 pages. But because they were limited to 1,000 pages, they made it so that you can read it from top to bottom, from right to left, from left to right, from bottom to top, and diagonally, from back to front, as well as front to back. So they kind of managed to kind of smuggle in several books, as it were, because you could read it in different directions and it would still make sense. So they really crammed it full of information, and they'd managed it. They'd done it. And Agamemnon's response is, oh, no, this is not it at all. This isn't what I want. What I want is a single sentence that contains the sum total of all wisdom. Okay, so then they go off again for a very long time. And finally they come back. And they come back with a dagger sheathed in a red cloth. This is decades later. He's incredibly old now. And the king draws the mirror-bright double-edged blade out of its sheath. And on both sides he read, "And this too shall pass." For a long time the king thought deeply and seemed almost to smile. This is better. Here is a comfort in sorrow and a check on joy. But even this is not enough. I've left too much room for interpretation and error, so I will rephrase the task one final time. Bring me everything. The skies and their clouds and the rain pouring into the oceans, and every grain of sand on all the beaches, every ant crawling on a stone, and every god in his pomposity, all in one single word. Okay. So showing no surprise, the counselors dispersed yet again. This time each went a different way and took nothing but the robes on their backs. Seasons came and went with unseemly haste. And finally, Odysseus alone, he's one of them, comes home. He takes the king's skeletal, bone-coloured claw of a hand when he gets back, and slips onto it a silver ring set with a blue gem, the colour of the western sky in the failing of the day. Look into the gem, sire. There is your word. Agamemnon looked, but what he made of the word is not recorded, because moments later he slumped forward, the interminable tyrant finally dead. Also not recorded is whether Odysseus had poisoned the ring or whether he had found the word and it sufficed. One word that contains everything is exactly what a koan is. That's a very good description of a koan. So I've already mentioned tonight's koan. What is the last word? Interesting, though. What is the last word? Could it be that there could be a word that is the last word, that that contains everything. That contains everything. I want to read you a little poem. This is just a recent poem that is somehow seems sort of pertinent to where we're going. Speak. Once again, don't speak of the unspeakable, but from the unspeakable. Let what cannot be said say what is said. Let what has no words say the words. Let what is said come by itself out of a silence that is nowhere and everywhere. Let what can never be said say what is said. Okay, so that's the poem. I don't know if that's any help. The last word. What is the last word? So, okay, so now let me come at another little angle, another little sort of background to koans, that's sort of another way of thinking about them. Again, some of you will have heard me talk about this before, but that movie about the aliens coming, Arrival, you remember, not all of you I know, I imagine have seen it, but so you see it if you haven't. It's a fantastic movie. The aliens come and they are sort of way more advanced than us. They can play with gravity, they can do all kinds of things, incredible engineering and whatever. And their language, they're sort of somewhat octopus-like. They're actually heptapods, 7 sort of legs, and they float in a kind of semi-liquid, semi-gas. That's their atmosphere, and they're very well, the way they communicate is not with. They have language, but it's a language that we don't know. What they do is they sort of, rather kind of squid-like, they sort of squirt out ink in a sort of circle. So somewhat like actually rather like a Zen Enso circle. They sort of squirt these circles out, and they have little bumps and knots and things sort of on them. And gradually, one extremely gifted linguist, human, sort of figures out slowly how to interpret, understand their language. But in doing so, she starts to, her sense of time gets very strange and changed. And she realizes gradually that by learning their language, she is changing her mind in a very profound way, such that her relationship with time is changing drastically, and her understanding of time is changing drastically. And the analogy with koans that I'm drawing here, and it's actually rather good, is that if we think of koans as a language, we can't understand what they're saying without our own basic conceptual framework of space and time, of past and future, being disrupted, thoroughly disrupted. Because the sort of the sense of things from which they speak can't be received by us in our current conceptual grid, if you see what I mean. In other words, the reality that the koans know, and that it really, in a sense, is their intention to convey, to sort of bring us to, we can't get it in our current understanding. And the primary sort of, building blocks, so to speak, of our current understanding that make the koans unintelligible are self and other, that there's a me that is contained by the skin bag, that is separate from everything outside this skin, this perimeter of this body, of this volume within my surface, is somehow owned by an entity, that is almost defined by being exactly not what is outside this perimeter of skin, if you see what I mean. Now, koans don't agree with that. They understand it, but they don't agree that that's an entire picture. There's another dimension, you could say. In fact, there may be even more than one other dimension in which that doesn't pertain. The distinction between in the skin, out of the skin, is lost. There's a medium, you could say, that is revealed by the loss of that assumption, which is a higher category or something, a larger category. So it contains within the skin and outside the skin. And not only that, but it contains, let's say you've got two trees. You think, well, that's one tree, that's another tree. They're separate. But actually in this level, they're not. It's like, I mean, one common analogy that you've probably heard is like, for this kind of thing, Yamada Koan used to say this quite a bit. It's like, you got a left hand and you got a right hand. And clearly they're two separate hands. But then you realize there's a body and they're both part of one body. And in his book, Zen, the Authentic Gate, he gives the example of, imagine you have a black hair on a table, and beside it you have a little drop of blood. So you've got a sort of black, little tiny sort of tubular, cylindrical object, long, thin cylinder. And you've got a little globule of a red liquid. And you think, well, two quite different things. Well, yeah, but one life in one body. So there's a little bit like that jump to realizing that there's a building and there's a car. And they seem to sort of be quite unto themselves. But actually, no. Well, yes, but no. There's sort of another level, another register, another dimension that we can find, we can experientially know, in which they're not separate. But the one thing about this dimension is you can't discover it as something you sort of see apart from yourself. You can only discover it when you are thoroughly implicated in it as well. Which is why this fundamental assumption about me in here, world out there, is probably sort of the critical one. Because when we see through that, when we discover that really the sense of self is, of course, it's thoughts, it's some narratives and some thoughts that have implicit narratives in them. And it's also a contraction. It's simply a tightening, subtle tightening in the mind field and somewhat in the body even. And it can just kind of release. It can just release. And the sort of withdrawing into being a separate entity just gives way, almost just relaxes. And the conviction about the narrative thread through time of me and my life that went with that kind of withdrawing into a separateness, that also can just puncture like a little, like a little bubble of soapy liquid floating over a lawn at a kid's party, that the lovely bubble, it just pops, which all those bubbles do. And this is the same thing. And koans you know, what they're trying to speak of can't be said in our language, none of our languages. Like those squirted heptapod circles, you know, they can't land in our version of the world. What has to happen is they actually have a secret way of changing our version of the world, of untying the knots that hold up our grid of the world, our implicit grid of space and time. Grid of time being past, present, future, grid of space being left, right, up, down, here, there, distance, separation between things. Both those, they're not really axes exactly, but both those, in both those arenas, the grid can be undone, can just drop. And we find what has no place, what has no time, and what can never be said. It itself is unspeakable. But it can speak, can do everything. No problem to speak. Otherwise, we wouldn't have koans. The koans are it speaking. What is the last word? Is it putting out a question? I mean, even right now, as Henry is saying, what is the last word? It, what can never be spoken of, what is unspeakable, is speaking. It is saying, what is the last word? And as it says that, it's inviting each one of us to find it, because we all can. All we have to do is drop our assumptions, our most cherished opinions, as Zen calls them. Now, all you've got to do is drop your opinions. Opinions about me being me and you being you. And the thing about it is you can say, well, why bother, really? I mean, I'm not interested or something. Why should I concern myself with this? And you know, nobody can say, oh, but you should be. You know, nobody can say that. But actually, the fact is, what they're pointing to is real. And in a certain sense, I think we almost have to accept that it's more real than our ordinary way of perceiving and experiencing, because it includes that. See what I mean? It's like it doesn't tear up our capacity to function in sort of sane, ordinary kind of way. No, it doesn't do that. You can still pick up any of the pieces of sort of ordinary functioning and understanding and processing. It's not a problem to do that, because you've dropped what's happened is that you're no longer clinging to them, attached to them, contracting around them as the truth of this life, this world. I must not drop. I mean, we don't think we're doing that, clinging tightly to them, but actually we are. And so, number one, when we release that, we're getting a broader, bigger view. And in other words, we're seeing more of what's real. So that alone is a value, you know, of some kind. But it has much more than that in it. Just one other little thing that it has that's immensely valuable, maybe not so little, is that keeping that sense of me going through a contracting that we don't know we're doing actually locks up a whole lot of energy. And when that energy is released from the job it's been doing of keeping the sense of me going, that we didn't realize it'd been doing at all, but when that energy, it no longer has to do that, there's a ton of energy freed up for what? For whatever. Just incredible universal energy just sort of arising and offering itself to the world. And some of you, I'm sure, were here last week when Peggy Sheehan Roshi from Denver was talking, and she was talking about, you know, the famous koan with a finger, Gute's finger, or Chu Chi's finger, as you call him, you know. And he said at the end of his life, having only taught by lifting one finger all his life, that was all he did to teach Zen, teach awakening, just this finger, you know. Ah, fantastic teaching. I mean, is this the last word? Anyway, at the end of his life, when he was about to die, he said, I used this one finger Zen all my life, and I haven't exhausted it. It's inexhaustible. It's the energy of the universe, whatever that energy is. You know, we're joining it. Of course, we are already part of it, but we're joining it experientially. We're finding that we really know. We really find we're part of it. But thirdly, most importantly, what it does is it reveals our inseparable participation in, belonging in the great family of all. So and to discover that is to discover essentially the foundation of our life and how we need to comport ourselves. In other words, it's the most sort of what's the word? Irrefutable ethical basis for life. To find that we are one with, we are part of one fabric, not as a notion, but as an experience. We're part of one substance of living things and even non-living things. We're part of it. We are that. So you can say we're part of it, but that still might suggest I'm a sort of element in it. But it's more than that. You know, I'm free to be you, but you're also utterly the same as, one with, inseparable. You're part of the inseparability. And that is it's a staggering thing to discover for us, because we don't know that we're so intimately held and belonging and just, it's beyond even being held and belonging. It's more than that. We're just so utterly at home, fully home. Before we've done a thing, we're already home, you know. And to find that so is everything else. We're all in one home. It is actually the basis for all ethical action, for all ethical direction. And that's just critically important at any time. And of course, now, when we are all so deeply conscious of the ways that terrible aggression and terrible greed and terrible ignorance, illusion, misunderstanding, delusion, ignorance are tearing up our world, you know. We know it. So this is why we must support as much as we can the forces that are working for good, all causes that are working for good, and do our part as much as we can. But it's not, you know, there's an actual basis for it, because we're all one. We're all part of the inseparability. And that's what koans want us to find. So you have a phrase like, what is the last word? You won't find the last word until you find it. And then you'll know. That's what the koan was trying to help you discover. Wasn't trying to elicit some clever or figured out thing. It's not like Wordle, you know, it's not like that at all. It's aimed straight at your heart, and it wants to stage a coup in your heart, and it knows how to do it. But we don't know how to do it. We will never know how to do it, but the koan knows. Okay, I think that's definitely what I wanted to say. Thanks very much for listening, everybody. What is the last word? Take it with you. Enjoy it. Don't worry it. Don't think you've got to measure up in some way. Don't think there's something you've got to get. In a sense, just enjoy sitting with what is the last word, and see what happens in your sitting. See how it affects your sitting, if it does in any way. Okay, actually, I can take a couple of questions, just a few minutes. If anybody wants to ask something, raise your hand in the reactions button. Okay, hi, Jonathan. Can you unmute?
Hello, can you hear me, Henry?
Yeah, hi.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the beautiful talk and reminders. I was actually just curious, the title and the author of the poem, or if it was you, I wasn't sure.
You mean that poem? That poem?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay. Can I find it somewhere, or is it unpublished?
Well, not yet, but maybe you will be able to. Thanks for asking. I'm happy that you'd like to. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to read it again, because I was like, oh yeah, there's something that felt very alive in there for me. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, maybe we'll get it up on the website or something soon.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Anybody else? Hi, Scott.
Hi, I was wondering, do they know, excuse me, what the first koan was? Is there a beginning? Is there a one?
Well, there in the Zen. Can you put on your camera, or is that difficult for some reason? It's okay if it is difficult. Oh, hi. Just wanted to see you. Okay, actually, you've muted in doing that. But anyway, I got your question. Well, there is actually in the Zen tradition, there is a first koan, which is Shakyamuni Buddha's awakening, which is when the story in Zen is that he looks up. He's been sitting for 6 days and nights without ceasing. He looks up on the sixth morning and sees at dawn and sees Venus twinkling in the sky. That's the first koan in Zen kind of thing. I'm just thinking actually, because there are, what is it? No, it's not. I mean, chronologically speaking, it's actually not the first, because there are, I don't know how far some of you know about this, but Mahayana Buddhism, which evolved around the 1st century BCE or CE, it elaborated a notion that only a Buddha could awaken another Buddha. And so therefore the question arose, well, how did Shakyamuni Buddha awaken? So they I don't know, posited, or whatever the word is, a Buddha before him. Well, then what about that one? That one needed a Buddha to awaken. So they posited another one. So they went back to 7 Buddhas prior to Shakyamuni. Then they thought, well, what about that, 7th one? How did he or she awaken? And so they ended up with thousands of pre-Buddhas, and actually there is a koan about a really sort of primordial Buddha from long before Shakyamuni Buddha, called something like marvelous, all-pervading wisdom Buddha, or something like that. All radiant, light pervading the universe Buddha, Daitsu Chisho Buddha, Bodhisattva. So he was a Buddha who sat forever and didn't awaken, but was a Buddha anyway. So he came down as the non-awakened Buddha, the non-attained Buddha. And then that's actually a koan. How can you have a non-awakened Buddha? It's a very nice koan. See, because then it's attacking, we might get the grid process going on awakening. Now I understand there's unawakened and there's awakened. I've got rid of self and other. Let's say I've woken up from self and other, but now I've got woken up and not woken up. That's another problem. That's the grid forming again. Just to think like that is already outside of the koan language. So you get the true koan language couldn't accept that. So you get a koan saying, how come there's an unawakened Buddha? It's a fantastic question for all of us. When we're feeling particularly unawakened, we're still Buddha. Okay, let's see. Maybe one more, if there is one. It's fine if there isn't, of course. Okay, seems like no question popping up. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you so much, Johanna, for taking care of everything tonight. I'll hand it back to you.